The ransomware situation in Australia has escalated to the point that policy has to shift. As we've seen from public testimony, the government is preparing to move on this. So it's wonderful to have this report from Rachael and Anne-Louise to feed into those deliberations. I'll very shortly hand over to Rachael to make some opening remarks. After that, I'll have some questions for her and Anne-Louise before I hand it over to you for your questions. Please submit your questions via the Livestorm portal and do vote up the questions that you like the most. I'll do my best to get through as many of them as is humanly possible. Finally, I'll just say that I'm so sorry that we couldn't have you here in person today because of the COVID situation, but I hope that we'll be back up and running very soon with our in-person events. With that, Rachael, maybe I can hand over to you for some just opening comments about the report and what it's about.
Thanks very much, Fergus, and thanks for having us. And I'm hearing maybe there might be some sound issues from some of our audience. If you could just check. Okay. Thanks for having us. We're here joined today, and it's our very first report we've ever done with ASPI, and we're very proud to do it on such an important topic and a timely topic. To us, it was really simple. Ransomware is on the rise, and you've given some examples of notable ransomware attacks. And we've recently had, obviously, the President of the United States comment about ransomware. We've had our own minister comment about ransomware. We had the 5 ministerial communique with the Five Eyes back in April. And again, ransomware was flagged as a top order issue. And we've had the Shadow Minister also talk about ransomware. So now is the time to act. It was clear. And it seemed to me that there was a lot going on, but what lacked in the community so far was a paper that discussed policy options and what could be done. And that was sort of lacking, we felt. And also, I think to start the conversation, one of the things we're committed to at the CRC, and I know ASPI is also committed to this, is the importance of starting a conversation. We don't necessarily profess to have all the answers. Our ideas might be different to others. But in democratic society, it's really important to start conversations, and the concept of contestability is key. So we wanted to start that and play a role there. It just seemed to me that now was the time to put something out there and get people talking about it and what can be done. Every day, and certainly through my career in cybersecurity over the past 10 years, and as a lawyer, poor cybersecurity posture was a cause for so much. There is so much that is avoided and is entirely foreseeable if cybersecurity posture of organisations is improved. And ransomware was no different to that. So to watch a scenario and to watch this playing out over the last few years, it seems to me that there's a lot that organisations can do to lift their cybersecurity. It's a shared responsibility, but the role of government and policy is incredibly important in setting the scene, just as the role of government to government is important and international community. But it starts here and it starts now. And I think the urgent message of no company is safe, no organisation that runs their business with a computer connected to the internet is safe, and it's just the urgent bells of action are ringing.
Great. Well, maybe I'll just start off with, excuse me for being a little bit sensationalist just to kick things off, but last Friday we had President Biden give the President of Russia a bit of a talking to over some recent ransomware attacks targeting US businesses. He also flagged retaliatory action like attacking servers directly, and an administration spokesperson said some of the retaliatory actions will be manifest and visible, some of them may not, but we expect those to take place in the days and weeks ahead. My question to you is, what do you expect the US will do? Will that approach work? And should we be punishing states that attack us too?
Wow, just a small question to start off with. Thanks very much, Fergus. Well, I don't want to really presume what I think the President of the United States intended or what they may do, but it's not uncommon. And of course, in the 2016 cybersecurity strategy, the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull talked for the first time about Australia's offensive cyber capabilities. And it tends to be that countries don't always talk in terms of we're going to use our offensive capabilities to hurt you. And it has been said in the past that even though a cyber attack may happen, it doesn't necessarily beget cyber, that the response is cyber. And it's well known that often disruption can occur on sites like has done with the dark web, on drug bazaars. and it just looks like a DDoS or a disruption, but nobody really knows where it comes from. I think if I could be so bold as to assume, I think part of what that is a bit of theatre around we take this stuff seriously and we mean business, and similarly I think those countries do. I think the issue here is the separation of, well, the bigger issue is attribution, and everyone kind of gets sucked into the whodunit aspect of cyber, and what actually two countries decide to do or how they decide to play the offensive game is something that countries sort of will determine behind closed doors. But I know here in this country, it's always been said we'll choose our time, and it may not be cyber that we'll retaliate with. But I think also what potentially Biden is saying is enough is enough. We are not going to tolerate it anymore, and we are going to take some sort of action. Now, whether that turns out to actually happen, we may never know what goes on. But it's an interesting position, because it's very rare that I've seen that between leaders, that they will actually talk about sort of that, cyber and cyber on cyber is unusual dialogue for world leaders.
Mm. I know in your report you cited some polling that the CRC had done on the number of businesses that said they understood what a ransomware attack was all about, but there was a proportion that said they did. I was surprised by how high that was, but there was a proportion who didn't know what a ransomware attack was. So I thought maybe, would you be able to just walk us through what, ransoms conjure up images of guns and being held hostage and things like that. What does it mean for a business that's had a ransomware attack, and how do they what does it look and feel like discovering that you've had one and you get a call that says, give me some money now, but this has happened, or how does it work?
Sure. So for the most part, for big organisations, ransomware at its heart is a criminal activity. It's a criminal activity designed to get money. It just is affected by cyber means. Often they find their way, and they being the cyber criminals, find their way in by a lure, and the lure is often clicking on a link. But they can also get stolen credentials. But in any event, they get in by a vulnerability of some sort into a system. In a big organisation, often the cyber criminals, the aim of the game is to find out what the important data is, where the important systems are, and literally they go around and post-it note it. And then they post-it note, what do we need to take, what do we need to take? They then start to lock up data, important data, but as they lock it up, they also take a copy, because that's helpful for the extortion element. They lock up key systems straight away. And so when a person goes into work, they open up their computer, and like our cover of our report, they get a skull and crossbones or a similar thing saying, oops, we've got your data, or here it goes. And you simply can't do anything at that point because your systems are rendered inoperable. They've then taken the data, they've got a copy, they've locked it up and taken it. And the ransom element is, they say, in order to get your data back, you need to pay us this much Bitcoin. They sometimes have a ticker on the side telling the victim how much time. Sometimes they have a helpful explainer about what ransomware is, but there's a very clear message, and that's the ransom note, what you need to do to get your data back. There's also an underlying sting. If you don't pay us within a period of time, we will either threaten to leak your data on the dark web, and we will make it known that we've got your data. There's pressure applied to the victim at that point, pay us. There's also added pressure, there's an interesting reputational pressure here, because it compels the party then to consider carefully what they're going to say publicly. Because if they say nothing to see here, no ransom, we're fine, they'll then start to leak and say, well, actually, we do have their data. We have done them. So there's an element of the extortion to put pressure on the victim, and also ensure a little bit of truth around what's happened to them should they go public with a different narrative. Then the clock starts ticking, the organisation debates what to pay and whether to pay the ransom, and then or they restore their backups and have a really good system, and they try and get back in business of some sort in the coming hours and days.
And you note that there's not a great set of data at the moment to show the incidence of ransomware attacks in Australia. With your role at the CRC, do you have a sense of what, and through incident responders and companies that are helping these firms that have been hit recover, do you have a sense of how many Australian businesses are being hit by ransomware at the moment, and what they're doing about it? How many are actually paying ransoms?
We don't have a sense of how many are being, other than what we talk about in the report, we don't have any great numbers around how many are being hit or whether they're choosing to pay the ransom. And I guess that's one of the reasons we wrote the report. A transparency around that would be helpful, so that it comes out of the shadows and it's a bit more of a public debate and narrative around that. What we do know is that some of them are publicly stated, and we talk about those in the report. They've publicly stated they haven't paid a ransom. There's obviously anecdotally, we suspect some have been paid, but we'll never know. And they're never very public about how much they pay. Again, in the report, we talk about the legal kind of the opaque sort of murkiness around payment of ransom and where organisations sit with payment of that ransom. So again, they're unlikely to talk about that publicly.
I also think it would be safe to assume that in terms of what we actually see being reported on in the media, for example, or, you know, when there is a big attack, that for that one attack, there's 3 or 4 others that we will never, ever hear about, that organisations themselves may keep, you know, close because they actually don't want that reputational damage that could occur.
And are the organisations that are being targeted, is it big business, is it small business, is it civil society, is it government, is it hospitals? I mean, who's being targeted?
Well, it's right across the spectrum. I definitely, I think, you know, through the reporting that we have seen, or we do see that health facilities are a particularly attractive target, and that's really because if health facilities go down, then people could die. So, you know, there is a lot of urgency there in terms of having to deal with the issue. So, and I think that's, you know, moving forward where we'll see more critical infrastructure entities being targeted. But I don't think, I think that it's fair to say that, you know, that ransomware criminals don't discriminate, and it happens right across the board. Obviously, in a bigger organisation, there are more financial gains to be made, and they might be more willing to pay potentially. But it also is a bit of a game of numbers, because ransomware criminals are looking for a weakness. And so, you know, while they might send out 100 emails with a dodgy link, all they need is one person to click on one of those links. And then they can start, you know, looking within a system for the systemic weaknesses.
One of the things that sort of engages me in terms of this particular type of cybercrime is the murky world that you enter into if you decide to go down the pathway of paying a ransom. Are you able to talk a little bit about these brokers, these companies that have been stood up to broker these ransom payments, and is that what's the law around that? Are they a legal type of operation, or where do they sit in the schema of things?
Well, we didn't actually address that in the report, Fergus, so thanks for that. Well, it strikes me that in Australia, if it's at best murky at the moment whether payment is legal, that even if we just transfer this to an ordinary physical crime, you're still involved potentially in the commission of a crime. Even if you hand off that element of the brokering to a third party, you've still got an issue there. And it doesn't matter if the third party's offshore. I still think they might be doing the not so pleasant part of the ransomware brokering to sort out the ransom. And there's not been a lot written about them other than their, in anecdotal terms, it's not a particularly pleasant business. People hand it off to them and it might be easier. My understanding though is that it's sort of pretty much a game, and so that everyone knows that they might, the criminals will ask for a certain number, but these brokers, my understanding is are relatively effective in knowing, yeah, they might ask for that, but we know we'll get to this. So they may play a role so that the victim is potentially very naive and goes, oh, I'll just give them 3 million Bitcoin. And those brokers might suggest, well, actually, we've dealt with them and we know it's less. Having said that, though, in Australia at the moment, the law is not clear. So either way, entering into an arrangement with them is risky because they're still doing that work of paying a ransom, which is, it's not clear who you're paying, and the Australian government hasn't come out yet with clear guidance around payment of ransom being something that they will criminalise or not criminalise, and that's an important thing. But the interesting, you know, that in sort of bad times, murky business models also spring up, a la the brokers.
Mm. And so if ASPI was struck by a ransomware attack and we were considering paying a ransom, what does the law in Australia say about where do I stand in terms of making that decision on whether or not you can pay legally or not? And are there consequences for people that pay, or what do you think should happen in that space?
Well, the law currently says that you could be financing a terrorist organisation or a sanctioned entity, and it's whether you knowingly pay because you know that those funds are not exactly going to pay private school fees. So the law, that it's not clear. There's not been case law around it that I'm aware of, and the law is certainly saying that in some cases you could be doing that. So whilst I've not seen the official guidance from Australian government is do not pay the ransom, but I'm not aware of statements where they've come out and said we will prosecute. I've not seen that at all. But similarly, I've not seen it where they've said we will not prosecute. I don't know if you've seen. I've not seen anything overt. In America, they've certainly said we will. It's not a criminal offence except with sanctions. Similarly, we sanctioned entities, and they have some guidance around that, around sanctioned entities and payment of note to sanctioned entities and countries. But again, their view is we will not criminalise it. They have said our strong advice is do not pay the ransom, but we understand in some cases it is unavoidable.
So one of the knee-jerk reactions you'd assume that a lot of people have in this space is to say, well, let's just ban people from paying ransoms and that'll shut this whole thing down. Your report points out that that's not the best way forward. Why is it that wouldn't work as an approach to stop this particular type of cybercrime?
Well, the view is you're actually punishing the victim twice. Not only are they being hit by ransomware, but you're then saying, we'll make it a criminal offence. So you not only have to worry about, well, if you do decide to pay the ransom, we're going to come after you, or you're going to potentially have the sword of Damocles hanging over you around whether you'll get prosecuted. And there's no evidence to suggest, although there's early days research-wise, and we haven't looked at this, whether it just results in a different outcome. Because I think at the moment we're seeing it probably people are paying it, they're not reporting it. So I think the better option is to give a pathway of clarity to businesses. So your point, what if ASPI was hit today? At the moment, it becomes a legal conversation very quickly. It's a technical conversation about what happened and how do we get our data back and how do we remediate. But if you've got to go, are we going to pay the ransom? What's going to happen? Do we have to get Bitcoin? Remembering masses of Bitcoin, you have to go and get those. You know that you've then lost control. It's anonymously paid. So you're in a murky world quickly. So I think some clarity again around we will not prosecute in these circumstances, or it could be critical infrastructure or certain circumstances where government will choose not to prosecute. But then we do recommend a mandatory reporting, so at least there's visibility of, not for a punitive sense, but there's visibility of who got hit, how they got hit, root cause. It could be that you have to hand up your incident responders report in a certain time frame, but at least there's collective information and it forms a collective understanding. So that benefits both government, because I get to a sense of who's doing what, but it benefits the broader business community because they are then in real time alerted to what's going on. There's enormous benefit in that, knowing what the current, and we saw that with the Colonial Pipeline, the Department of CISA were constantly updating, and we saw that when the Department of Justice hit and retrieved the digital wallet back, they hit the media. They went out to about 30 different outlets and talked about doing it and talked about that was what they wanted to do, and sent a clear message around that they were, I mean, it was unusual, but they wanted to retrieve that digital wallet back and steal it back because they thought that was the right thing to do.
I think it's also really useful to note that there's little, even though the US and the Treasury last year released a statement saying, these are a list of sanctioned entities, and if you pay them, then you could be liable, or we can take civil action against you. But as we saw with Colonial Pipeline, DarkSide were one of those entities, and no action's been taken. In fact, assistance was rendered. And so I think there is the US experience has shown that there's little appetite to take that kind of action against entities that have been attacked, even if there is a sanctioned list. I think that the approach that we're seeing now, we saw in that case, and we will be seeing more in the future, is a follow the money approach.
Well, let me just pick up on I want to come to the recommendations in a moment, but the Colonial Pipeline example. One reading of this attack and the JBS attacks is that cyber criminals are becoming increasingly brazen, and they're going after these really high-profile entities that are going to, cause consumers real harm. But the thing that my reaction to that is, well, they've also engendered, retaliatory actions from nation states that are far more capable than the cyber criminals. They've had their ransom payments, pulled back. So is your assessment that we're headed down that pathway of more and more brazen attacks by cyber criminals, or is there a sweet spot where they're much better suited, where it's just below the radar of state attention, where they can still extract ransoms, but they just sort of keep on flying under the radar and they're a huge annoyance and a huge cost on business, but not at the level that we're seeing with, say, Colonial Pipeline or JBS Meats?
Yeah, undoubtedly. I think Colonial Pipeline was interesting because you saw the flow-on effects of them shutting down the supply. So there is the brazen element, and also what will be the impact if we do this? Not that I sort of have stepped into the mind of a ransomware cyber criminal, but yes, if you can affect an impact and you can exert pressure, it will mean that the organisation has to pay quicker or has to take some action. So I think potentially they're very big targets. They were ones, and the same with the meat supply, a global supply chain. But then you saw with Toll Holdings twice, global supply chains, and it's publicly reported they didn't pay the ransom. So, and yet that had a knock-on effect. So I think there's a couple of things. They're brazen, but they'll go where they can get in, and it's shown that there are vulnerabilities. They're able to get in, and they're able to successfully exert pressure to either get the ransom paid in some cases, but to have the victim take actions to not either pay or to shut down pipelines or shut down meat supply. The consequential effects of laying off workers in the JBS had a huge impact. So a combination of brazen, but they do, whilst those attacks get a lot of attention, there are lots of low-level attacks in the US, particularly around counties, tying up entire US counties that can't operate because they've been hit and they have a lot of legacy kit they aren't able to remediate quickly. So it's, as Anne-Louise said, a game of numbers and a game of targets. There's lots of rich targets at all sorts of different levels because the cybersecurity posture isn't right.
I think the other really vexed part of that is the fact that, for example, and again, going back to the US, because that's where we have a little bit more evidence of where things have happened. But, there have been cases, for example, I think in Florida, there was a case of, a local department, or it was a department, I think, within Florida. And they kind of, got hit and were asked for a ransom, say it was $1 million. Now, they didn't pay that ransom. The remediation cost for them to recover was many more millions. So again, when you're looking at the decisions that an organisation have to make, is that, okay, well, I won't pay the ransom as a matter of principle, and that would cost me $1 million, whereas I won't pay it, and then I have to pay $20 million to remediate everything.
Well, on that question, I mean, you're dealing with a lot of Australian businesses and executives through your role. What's their reading, in your sense, of the two different scenarios that we've talked about here, Toll and the example that you just gave of a company that decides not to pay and to remediate versus a company that, Colonial Pipeline, that does pay to try and get its operations back up as quickly as possible? Is the reading that we pay and therefore we'll get back up and running as quickly as possible, or is it that we pay and we've got no idea what's going to happen and we're better off just fixing it up and doing our best?
I think a bit of both, and I think there's a bit of panic that when I go to lawyers, the lawyers will help us out of that, and also they look to lawyers to get that advice too. And knowingly, lawyers are not going to give advice around breaking the law. I think there's both camps. I think there's a camp, and then I think there's if I can add a third camp of a bit of a sort of how could this kind of happen? Is this really happening? Is it that serious? We just want to get back into business, a bit of impatience. And I think that's when it all comes home to roost, that IT and cybersecurity rests with the board and the leadership, and it's not just the guy in level 5 who's dealing with it. And all of a sudden, I'm sure flashing in front of their faces are all those sort of traffic light reports they've seen in board packs and stuff where they go, oh, I think I remember somebody telling us about this. And I think that's where it all of a sudden becomes clear that this is their problem. It's not the guy on level 5. It's their problem to start fixing, and also their problem to suddenly go, how do we get done over? We would never have known about this vulnerability. And also starting to ask questions to Anne-Louise's point, remediation can be incredibly not only expensive and long and complex because you've got to find out where it is. Once ransomware is in there, you've got to make sure you've got to pick it out and it's all picked out and all the systems are okay to reconnect. And that in a large organisation is not over in a week. It can take months to do that. So I think it's a whole bunch of realisations and there's a different camps. But foremost in the mind of any director or leader will be, we need to get back in business quickly, but having a really clear understanding of what that means is a whole other ballgame.
I just wanted, before I get into the recommendations, I just wanted to touch on whether in a sort of philosophical sense, this is a different type of cybercrime often just gets bundled into this bucket of cybercrime. Is there something distinctive about ransomware that makes it different from other types of cybercrime and therefore potentially having unique opportunities to stop that part of cybercrime? Or is it all essentially come down to the same sort of vulnerabilities and same sort of issues that we're dealing with in cybersecurity generally?
Well, it comes down to the same issues. Absolutely, the vulnerabilities in getting is the same issues, that there's a known problem often and a known fix, but people haven't done it. I think the difference here is, in my mind, ransomware is very different because there's a time pressure and there's the pressure of extortion, and that is not seen in other forms, and in my experience, in normal data breaches or hacks. That's not seen. It's often the data is just stolen and it's gone. In this sense, you actually can't operate your business, number one. So you're out of operation. Number two, you've a time pressure to pay. Number three, you've got an extortion element if you don't pay. Number four, the extortion element is your data is going to be leaked on the dark web and or publicly made. So you're under pressure to make sure your narrative, if you say we haven't been hit and nothing to see here, all this, I think what it's also done is stopped companies from the hackneyed line of we've had a cyber incident, but we can see no evidence of data being stolen in cases where they go, well, that's actually not true because we've stolen your data. So it's a high time pressure environment, and really there are many points which just weren't evident in other breaches that I've seen to really make a leadership team and a board and an organisation feel the pressure, feel the heat, take action, and be really careful of what they say publicly, because they know it could also come back to bite them again in their reputation, because the hackers go, well, actually, you're not being incredibly honest. So in my mind, this is a very different crime type. I think it's often, it almost is described in terms where it's sort of, it happens and springs up and nobody knows why. It's a crime type because of vulnerabilities mostly, but it's a very different crime type that is unusual in cyber and in the physical world, but that's why it's talked about, and I think everyone is desperate to find solutions, and some of that rests with the companies themselves, or to look to government to help where it can, not solve the problem, because again, a lot of the responsibility rests with organisations to look after their own cybersecurity, but where government could help, where that's possible, I think there's pressure there too.
I think adding to that as well, one of the key differences with ransomware is that the rewards for the criminals involved are particularly lucrative. So it's a bit different from standard e-crime in that regard, certainly. And I think the thing that we're seeing that's really different about ransomware is the fact that it's scalable and it's actually being sold as a service, which you don't necessarily see with other e-crime. So I think those two factors make it particularly interesting as well, where you've got the really lucrative gains if you can pull off an attack, and the fact that yes, this is scalable, it's sold as a commodity on the internet and people can buy it as a service.
Well, that's one of the things I think you mentioned in the report, how it's sold as a service, and people that are relatively untechnical can buy these tools and get sort of instructional kits on how to apply them. Is that the case that there's been a lowered bar to entry for this type of crime, and the fact that people are now able to so easily use these tools to access our companies? Does that speak to the incredibly low levels of defense that we've got at the moment, in terms of people can easily, non-technical people can wander into people's systems and just start exfiltrating data at will?
I think it's also the fact that some of these tools are actually quite sophisticated. Within the report we cite some findings that came out of the US that you can go online onto the dark web and buy particularly quite sophisticated malware for about $66 Australian. It's about $50 US. And then you can also get tutorials and things like that will teach you how to use it. But going back to your point, it all really does come back to cyber security in the end, because if you've got a good level of cyber security, then you're going to be far more protected against those kinds of intrusions.
So I wanted to get to the recommendations and what we should do about this. What's the best defense against being hit by ransomware? And could I give you it through the lens of a hypothetical? So I sit on a couple of charitable boards and we raise, $4 or $5 million a year. We don't have an in-house IT person in the organisation. What would you recommend to an organisation that's sort of an SME in Australia with no in-house IT support that has to sort of try to wrap their heads around what to do about ransomware?
Sure. That's a good question. Well, and we're in the same boat. We don't have an IT person who's security dedicated as well. But you can buy services through either managed service providers who you can get part of their advice, and certainly the ACSC has guides. But you can buy services and part-time, sort of by hours if you like, and get them to do an assessment of your cybersecurity environment and get some advice there with some repeatable actions that can be taken to keep the cybersecurity up. And in fact, we're doing a pilot in South Australia on this very topic of how we can bring it to SME so that it's repeatable but easy. But it's really important that that discipline is in place early and that the CEO is responsible for that and it's reported out to the board, because you're right, small businesses like a charity can't afford it, but they do need to be conscious of their cybersecurity and can do it in a way that is effective. And it's like anything, you have to maintain it. It's not set and forget, but it is something that's absolutely achievable. It's never, I should add, nothing's ironclad, nothing's perfect, but at least it will be, you will have a fighting chance if you have a better cybersecurity posture, because Anne-Louise says it just takes one, and this is a random game of numbers. So if you're a harder target, what you want is them to move to the next person, but you do need to be doing something. It can't just be, we're going to run our business out of Gmail and do an update every now and then. There does need to be conscious effort, and that's why briefing a board is important, because it gets you into a cycle of having it regularly in your board pack. But it's got to be not just reporting in paper and policies, it's got to be operational stuff you do, your organisation does on a quarterly basis, that is done by someone, even part-time or casual hours, but it's maintained by someone. That's really important.
I think too, like as raised in the report, there are those three really basic things. There's patching, there's multi-factor authentication, and there's training people. And education is it plays such a pivotal role. And I think it was really interesting last week at the PJCIS, you were there, obviously, Fergus, but when Christopher Krebs from the US, he really hit that point home that people have to be educated, that there has to be an investment in education. And I found that particularly heartening, because quite often that gets lost in all the noise. It's, you can have the best kit on earth, but when it comes down to it, if you still have people that will click on dodgy links, then what use is that?
One of the key recommendations that I read in the report, at least, was around this mandatory reporting of ransomware attacks. Could you explain what that would look like and how it would work?
Sure. So our idea would be that it would be civil notice, that entities, once they have been hit with the ransomware attack, they're under an obligation to report to the Australian Cyber Security Centre that they are the victim of a ransomware attack, and within a certain time frame. And we've notionally put 21 days, but it may be slightly different. And in fact, Chris Krebs again touched on something similar around reporting in the US, as you know, on Friday, that they would have to then report out the root cause, as in how they were done over, to the ACSC, so that that can be aggregated and reported out. So it's not just held by the ACSC, that the ACSC would then make those reports available or certainly root cause on an anonymous basis available for the public, so that there's greater awareness out there. And the point is that it gets organisations drawn in. They are not then hiding it. They then report out about what's happening, and their obligation is to do something about it. They obviously remediate. My experience in my past lives, particularly as a lawyer, is a positive obligation is something you can work with, because you can actually say to the board, we have no choice, we're obliged to report it. It stops these things from going under the radar. And again, I stress, we did this because more and more that it's out there, more and more that it's reported, there's collective understanding. It's not to punish the victim, it is to get it out there so that when this happens, at the year end, we will have a much better understanding, did they get in through this vulnerability? Was it because this organisations, 60% of them didn't patch? Or was it, yes, employees just clicked on links? That's really valuable for society to hear about, and it helps everyone when we can make sense of the data. At the moment, we have no data that we can make sense of other than anecdotally. There's nothing to give us patterns and data speak volumes when it comes to cybersecurity breaches. So that's what we would suggest would go enormously. Mandatory reporting, and it also allows them to, not necessarily the ransom question and whether payment of ransom, whether that will be something that goes further, but mandatory reporting certainly allows government to get a window in, public to have a view, but the company then has to come forward and lay it bare, and that's important as well.
And it would be via an aggregated data reporting rather than naming and shaming companies.
Absolutely. But it's got to be timely, and I think CISO does this in the States. They make it timely, ongoing public communication through some of the major breaches that were happening recently. I think what doesn't help is when reporting is 6 months later. Everyone's forgotten, nobody remembers. It's got to be timely and accurate and available for people to say, oh, real-time reporting helps. So, but definitely not about naming and shaming. It's not about re-victimising the victim's experience, but it's about helping people understand in real time, particularly organisations, what they can do to make sure that that doesn't happen to us, because often there's enough examples, and certainly boards can learn from other examples, but if that information is being fed back up to an organisation, they can make sure that that particular vulnerability they're aware of, they can deal with that.
Another recommendation I liked was around incentivising cybersecurity uplift. One of the big challenges to me in this space is that we all know cybersecurity needs to be improved in Australia, but no matter how many cases there are of businesses going bust because of poor cybersecurity or paying a ransom, getting hit by ransomware, they seem to systemically underinvest in cybersecurity. So, and I've noticed, I think the government might have even, coincidentally borrowed some of your ideas in the document that came out today. But could you talk a little bit about some of your ideas about how you'd address that conundrum through incentivising uplift?
So there are really two main parts to that. And so the first one is incentivisation through existing mechanisms through the taxation system. So it's instant asset write-off, which is also called temporary full expensing at the moment. They can be used the same way, but basically the way that this is sort of viewed out in the public is that, fantastic, I can buy a new ute, I can get some tools, and that's really the way it's been sold as well. But what we're saying is, okay, so let's upgrade our cybersecurity because we can, reap the taxation benefits from that. The way it is at the moment, the guidance from is quite unclear as to what can be claimed. So one of the recommendations that we've made is that there needs to be, basically, quite a prescriptive kind of list. This is what you can claim under this, and that would help organisations know what they can claim and then invest in that. So even though they still have to outlay money, they do get the taxation benefit, and that's a fantastic scheme. And I think if that could be leveraged to uplift Australia's cybersecurity posture generally across a whole lot of organisations, then that's a fantastic thing. The other key point that is raised within the incentivisation is around government procurement. And, the government is one of the largest or the largest procurer in the country. So if there could be minimum cybersecurity standards set for organisations that want to do business with government and be procured by government for their services, then they have to hit that minimum standard. And that goes to a whole lot of things. It's about supply chain, all that, but it would be a great carrot for organisations, and there are a lot of them that procure to government to uplift their cyber security posture.
I'm going to open it to the audience questions, and there's a voting system, so there's a bit of democracy at play here.
Right.
So the most upvoted question is from Bart, and it says, in the report you write ransomware is totally preventable.
Mm-hmm.
How? And what good practices of prevention or resilience do you see in Australia or elsewhere?
Sure. So it's totally foreseeable and preventable because it's a known problem. It's known that ransomware is out there, and it's known that invariably the cyber criminals get into organisations through the stealing credentials that they get on the dark web and getting in through vulnerabilities like credentials or clicking on a link and a vulnerability. So this is not, there are some very sophisticated cyber attacks, and we're not talking about those because they are very hard to defend against. But it's entirely preventable because it's foreseeable. And as Anne-Louise said, and what we talk about in the report, patching. A lot of hacks happen, and ransomware is no different because systems are just left unpatched. And what that means is they're vulnerable. They've got security vulnerabilities. Multi-factor authentication, so that your passwords can't be guessed, so that one way of getting into an organisation is just guessing passwords of key people, but we're still guessing the password of the sysadmin who actually has the passwords for entire systems or people in the organisations. Having really strong password and multi-factor authentication, making sure that you have good access management so that people that only known employees and people who have access to systems should have access to them. There's a whole range of an essential aid, ASD's essential aid is that. So we're not talking about some sort of nation state, really funky sort of 0 day that's happening. This is going the world over. So it's entirely foreseeable. And I think, as we've said, companies should all be on notice. And as the US government put out early in June and Neuberger, no company is safe. Companies are on notice that this is a risk for them. So that's how I'd say that this couldn't be a surprise for any company on the globe, that this is a known threat, and whilst you can't have ironclad security, there are 4 or 5 steps you could take that could significantly mitigate this risk.
Philip asks, and I know this was only addressed in a small way in the report, but should insurance companies be paying ransoms?
That's a really good policy question, and I've thought about that quite a bit. Look, there's an argument that no, they shouldn't, because that then just makes it easy for companies to point to the insurance company and go, oh, well, they'll just pay for us and we just get on with the job. I think there has to be a real question around the role of insurance paying the ransom. Why would they pay? Should they pay in circumstances where the company actually had incredibly good security, but for some reason they got in? I'm not sure it is the right thing from a policy perspective for insurance companies to pay ransoms, but there could be an argument that for small organisations, they're allowed to pay up to a certain cap and things like that. Cyber insurance as a whole concept is a very immature market, and I think after a while anyway that you'll probably find they won't start paying ransoms because people will rely on them for that kind of cover, if you like. So I'm not sure it's the right way to go for insurance companies to cover ransoms. I'd rather see them do something like, we'll actually give you a premium rebate if you invest in cybersecurity. So again, the cyber insurance industry as a whole can play a huge role in incentivising uplift. So offering incentives for uplift, trimming premiums and doing that kind of good work to really play a key role in driving down this risk.
And what is the type of ransoms that you're hearing people being paid? Is it sort of type of ransom that would shut down your business, or is it?
Small organisations, yeah, it could completely put you out of business. For larger, we know about the public large ones, millions and millions and millions of dollars. Small ones, it can be a small amount of money. But it's not just that, it's a business interruption. If you're a small business and you can't even get your customer book up, your appointment book, it'll take days to get back online. And maybe that's not crippling, but it's the business inconvenience. If you're a tradie or something like that, getting that resurrected and you rely on that to, that income coming in to feed your family and things like that, that has a huge impact on organisations, big and small.
Yeah. I've got a question here from Alison. She says, the messaging does not seem to be getting through to small to medium-sized businesses. It's in the won't happen to me basket. Do you envisage that we could use supply chains as a lever for driving adoption of mitigating practices in SMB suppliers?
And I think, well, the procurement question or the procurement point in terms of incentivisation certainly goes a long way to that. And I know that obviously with the critical infrastructure legislation that's before federal parliament at the moment, that's certainly something that is under the spotlight in terms of that whole supply chain. And even, the organisations that will be feeding into the critical infrastructure entities, that there will be or could be requirements on them to actually uplift their cybersecurity. So likewise, I guess critical infrastructure entities moving forward will play a key role in this puzzle as well, because the smaller entities, the small and medium enterprise that's feeding into those supply chains, if the critical infrastructure entities, especially those with positive security obligations, say, okay, to do business with us, you need to meet this minimum standard, then there will be that incentivisation for the SMEs to actually uplift themselves as well. So it's a similar kind of, I guess, model to what you would see with government incentivisation.
Brandon's asked, and I think this is a fascinating question, was there a reported increase of ransomware during the pandemic period? What did the pandemic do in terms of influencing this particular type of cybercrime? Is there any sense around that?
Yeah, there was. Certainly, the ACSC has reported that there was an increase, and in the US, where there are, I guess, figures, there was quite a significant increase. There was a particularly funny New Yorker cartoon that was a group of sort of mafia bosses in an office together, and it says, for workplace health and safety reasons, we're going to have to turn to cybercrime. And I think that kind of sums up what we saw during or what we continue to see in terms of the pandemic and cybercrime more generally, but ransomware, especially in terms of those big payloads.
And do you have a sort of an understanding why the pandemic is driving that? Is it more people being at home? Is there less opportunities for other types of cybercrime that would traditionally be?
Well, less opportunities for other types of crime as well. So, for example, I'm sure that, that groups were possibly dealing in drugs or those sort of things have actually pivoted a bit, like everyone else has, to a new business model.
We've got a question here from Tim, and it said, should businesses, especially big businesses, be required to meet higher compliance standards around planning for cyber attacks? For example, running annual exercising, having an effective crisis management plan and crisis communications plan, etc.
Sure, I think through potentially the changes to the critical infrastructure and the positive security obligation, critical infrastructure will be required to potentially do a lot more, depending on where they are and whether they're regulated, in terms of uplifting cybersecurity posture. Part of that may be that they will have to, in order to execute on those changes, to do those exercises and crisis management. But my experience is that the large organisations have crisis management apparatus in place anyway, because it's not just cyber they deal with a whole bunch of potential crisis management issues. Exercises are always a good thing, and again, I don't know if government would necessarily get to the point where they want to be so prescriptive about what might be in it, except if you're a system of national significance. But it would seem to me that as part of good practice for big organisations and small, that is part of the regime that all organisations should embark upon. It certainly would be something I'm sure regulated industries would do, but it can't hurt to have that kind of approach, absolutely not, because it exposes what can happen in a real-time scenario. It can expose all sorts of things that you don't sort of envisage.
This is not the most upvoted question, but it's coming in from Stilgarian, who said, Rachael said that like other cybers, it's a known problem with a known solution, brackets defence. We've had cyber wake-up calls for 20 years and we're still giving basic messages. Maybe it's time to let Darwinism loose, let organisations who are lazy get hacked and let God sort them out.
Thanks, Stilgarian. I love that approach. And look, he's absolutely right. I've been in this now for 10 years. I was a lawyer before that, but also I dealt with data breaches. It is glacial-like movement. And I think the only change now that might accelerate is legislation, which obviously government is potentially seeking to introduce at the moment the changes to the critical infrastructure legislation, which I have to say no other country is doing in the same scale Australia was doing. That is truly, I think, a good thing, but he's absolutely right. In 10 years I've been in this, it's been a small incremental change. And look, in the early days, we had people like Leon Panetta in the US sort of say, oh, there's got to be a cyber Pearl Harbor. Well, that was 2011, he said that. That's not happened yet. But what we will see is as 5G comes in, more and more devices talk to each other. There's a far rapid rate of interconnection. You will, I think, see potential vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure. I kind of wonder, though, in a macabre kind of ways, will the test be when people just can't use their phones for half an hour and then everyone, because I've got to tell you, when Telstra used to have an outage, I mean, within 5 minutes, the device would almost be smoking with the amount of tweets going, oh, is Telstra down, is Telstra down? So I wonder whether it's just something that matters to all of us so much that it will be an unacceptable level of downtime, and that's when you'll get people going, oh, we just have to have law about this because we can't cope with phones, internet, fridge, streaming, Netflix, you name it. But it'll have to get to a point, and I think I was reflecting on this on the weekend. When there are plane crashes, you have the NTSB and they go in and they do a remarkable job in the face of tragedy. Of course, people have died. They do a remarkable job of piecing together what happened to the point where they go back and look at the captain's pattern of life days before and things like that. I think the thing is, people don't think people die with cyber events, but ultimately they could. It could really, really impact life and be a threat and risk to life. So I think people have to start thinking about this as not some sort of a joke. It is actually real. And the fact that we joke about the internet being down for 30 minutes, it could be the matter of a medical procedure is stopped and someone dies halfway through, things like that. This has the ability to impact our way of life, how we live it, and really, in some cases, our lives.
I also like the idea of a special project for the cybersecurity firms to go after our mobile phones, to shut them down for half an hour as the vector for change.
That's right, yeah. Well, I think all of us would be twitching at some point at about the 5-minute mark. I think absolutely.
My 8-year-old would not be happy.
Yeah, I think all of us take it for granted, and I've said this before. I kind of challenge anyone to live a day in the life of 1985 or something like that. When I was sort of a teen, when obviously Google didn't exist, so it makes me really ancient. But I defy you to try and live off the grid for a day. No devices, you obviously can't get money, you have to have cash, you can't be tracked, and see how far you get, because it's a challenge. So Stilgherrian might be right that maybe we should still go, you know what, go for it, and let's see, may the survival of the cyber fittest win.
I think it's too when people actually understand too how ruthless these criminals can be, and there's a bit of a lack of understanding of that comes from that lack of transparency that we see. For example, we know that at the height of the pandemic, there were aged care homes being attacked, and when they were attacked, the duress systems were brought down, were taken down on purpose. That's really, it makes you feel very upset for the people and the families affected. And I think that if there was more information out there like that this is the kind of tactics that are involved, that can really help hit it home as well.
We've got a question from Yasin, who said, can the UN's International Telecommunications Union undertake a leading role on the struggle against the global ransomware crisis? Or should some specific countries / political unions, e.g. Australia, the UK, EU, USA, etc., create a new international body instead of the ITU to deal with cybercrime in a global context?
Probably would avoid the unions of the ITU or anything like that. I think there are already organisations like Europol and obviously the law enforcement that work together. I know a lot goes on at the country-to-country level, and international norms are very important. Again, getting back to there is often glacial-like movement for country to country, but it is important that countries come out and object to certain behaviour. There is some power in that. This is very much, even though often the perpetrators are offshore and very difficult to prosecute because they're in jurisdictions that are very difficult for Australia don't have extradition treaties and to reach. The real change comes about at a domestic level. In my view, I think all those things need to go on. There's a place for all that. But the change has to come from here, our government, our people, our organisations, our boards, our leaders. Change starts here. All great if that falls into line internationally, but I'm not waiting for that. I want to see the change happen now here domestically. And in fact, it's my responsibility as a leader and a business leader to do my bit here now.
I've got a question here around, Shaquille's asked, if you're victimised on your mobile or computer, I've heard that it's best to just get rid of that device and start again, as your device is now vulnerable and there's no guarantee that they won't release or delete your information. Do you have any recommendations for businesses in relation to this?
In terms of your mobile device, if you think you've been hacked or popped, you can actually just erase it and go back to erase settings as if you were starting it from new. I'm not in the business of obviously giving out all that kind of advice, but the Australian Cybersecurity Centre has lots of guides on certain aspects of that. But like anything, you should always just go back to basics and yes, wipe, delete, but definitely wipe. But I would advise people in that situation, particularly small business, to go to the Australian Cybersecurity Centre and have a look at some of their guides around whether you believe your devices have been compromised and what to do about that.
I might just ask one or two more. We won't get through all the questions, but Bill has asked, could this issue have a life cycle like aircraft hijackings? What factors could make it so?
Yeah, sure. Like bank robberies had a life cycle as well. When companies are no longer done over because they're too harder targets, the cyber criminals are not finding it, to Anne-Louise's point, lucrative anymore. They're just not getting money out of it. They move on to something that's more lucrative for them. Bitcoin is highly regulated, therefore it's very difficult for ransoms to be paid anymore, and it dries up as a lucrative opportunity for cyber criminals. And then like bank robberies, which I think happen really rarely now, they just won't happen as much anymore because the targets are harder, currency is hard to get, and people have got outstanding cybersecurity.
This might be our last question. Jayesh has said, what is preventing a multilateral effort against cybercrime, similar to the ones the world has for terrorism and financing?
Well, it's a big question.
Yeah.
And I think those steps are certainly being taken. You know, we see within, obviously within the Five Eyes and the Quad, there's been a lot of discussion. And between the ES and the EU, we're seeing a lot going on there as well. I think, you know, obviously globally there are a lot of, there's not a huge amount of harmonisation when it comes to the cyber environment generally. So I think that makes it difficult. And also in terms of cyber crime, the transnational element of it makes it particularly difficult to deal with. So jurisdictionally, it can be really tricky, especially, you know, if you've got, you know, states that are, you know, allowing this kind of activity to happen, because if they're not part of that, then it's going to be very difficult to stop it. And again, you know, if you've got, it's quite difficult to know whether or not something is state-sponsored or just state-based. So there's the whole, I guess, ethical quandary there about, you know, well, do you take action against a state if something is state-based as opposed to state-sponsored? And that's problematic as well in terms of, you know, international norms as they stand.
Great. Well, I might wrap it up there, but I just wanted to say we're in an empty room here at ASPI HQ because of the COVID situation. So it's been very heartening to have signs of life coming in the forms of your questions, streaming in on the iPad here. So I wanted to thank you all for the many, many questions that came through this afternoon and this evening. It's been wonderful. I haven't been able to get through all of them yet. There's been so many, but it's great to see the interest and the enthusiasm and the really informed questions coming through. So thank you very much for that. And please join me in a virtual clap for our two authors, Rachael and Anne-Louise. Thank you so much for doing this, and thank you for the wonderful report and contribution.
Thanks very much for having us.
Yep.
It's been terrific.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
the opportunity.
Thanks, everyone.